There are moments in life that arrive wearing ordinary clothes and soft shoes, and if you are not careful, you let them pass you by because they look like errands and grocery lists and the small, forgettable architecture of your daily life. Later, only in memory, you find that those ordinary moments were doorways, that you had been standing in front of a threshold without knowing you were about to cross it. I remember the threshold as a couch. I remember it as a hallway, a winter wind pressing against a barely closed door. I remember it as the way his hand would hover, as if deciding where to land, then land simply because it could. I remember thinking, over and over, that there were rules I had learned to live by, rules about what to keep quiet, rules about how to survive without needing to be held, and how, once you notice that one person can hold you without accusation, those rules start to feel like paper-thin things the first time you try to wear them in the rain. I had been walking through a quiet, patient life. Coffee early, film development in the back room of a studio that smelled like Fixer and lemon oil. Evenings of unlaced loneliness where I told myself I was simply practicing solitude. My name was a small, comfortable thing. It fit the way my shirt's draped and the deliberate slowness I used to shake hands. For a long time I believed I was a man content with being the quiet observer, an artist who learned other people's faces the way a sailor learns constellations, by lines and repeating patterns, by how small gestures traced a map of who someone was. He was my professor, though that felt far too clinical when I spoke it aloud in my head. Calling him professor reduced him to an office number and a lecture schedule, and he was the opposite of a title. His name moved like sunlight on a wall, simple, necessary, bright. He taught contemporary visual theory and the ethics of image-making, but his lessons bled into the days between classes. A laugh over burnt coffee in the department kitchen. A comment about composition that ended with our fingers occupied arranging equipment together. He had a way of leaning into a conversation like he was adjusting the frame around an image, and when he did, his whole body, hands, voice, the small leaning of his shoulder was an argument for attention. I had noticed him before the semester began because people like him have a sort of gravitational pull, the way some buildings have light fixtures that collect moths. He was younger than most of the professors in our department, which made students talk about him in a way they did not about the older faculty, as if youth were a spice to be commented on, or a curiosity. He taught at odd hours and kept office hours that smelled of chamomile and paper. He had a laugh that made the corner of his mouth break, and he used my name on the first day of class as if it belonged next to his own, which made something in my chest feel like a photograph developing slowly. A latent image saturating with possibility. There is an odd economy to being someone who watches. You learn to catalog what you see in order to keep yourself from drowning in it. Small details become currency. The tilt of his head when he listened to students, the invisible way he kept his scarf flung over the back of his chair, the way he would straighten a stack of books with fingers that seemed meant for delicate machinery. I noticed the cut of his jaw when he smiled. I catalogued the scar that traced the soft crescent of his thumb, a small white hill at the base of his knuckle. I told myself was nothing, but that my thumb brushed against once by accident in the dark when we were both reaching for the same roll of film. I had learned to be careful with desire. Desire was a thing I had managed at the edges of my life, like a fire kept in a stone hearth, contained, useful, but never allowed to walk into the rooms. There are practical reasons for this. The dynamics of the work world had taught me the language of limits, of appropriate touch, of electrical lines you do not cross. But the heart is not always practical, and I found my heart breaking its own rules in small, ridiculous ways, a joke that lasted a beat too long. An email that pinged my phone at 12 in the morning with nothing in it but his name, a shared taxi in the rain that felt like a raft for two. Our friendship was built of thin, patient things. He would come to the darkroom to watch, leaning against the doorway, chin in his palm, asking questions that were not about technique so much as light as metaphor. I would show him prints as if showing a private photograph. He would look at the image and then at me, and his gaze would hover on the way I had chosen to capture a face or a sky. We shared lunches that blurred into long conversations about other lives, books we loved, the oddities of our families, the list of mistakes that had become necessary education. He demonstrated kindness the way he taught by being present, and that presence was a solace, the way shelter is when you have walked long enough in a cold storm. I told myself, in a voice I thought was steady, that my feelings were harmless and contained. There is a particular shame to wanting someone you cannot have. It is a private ache, a thing you tuck away like contraband, and you learn to smooth the crease of the paper closed so no one notices. I folded the ache neatly because the consequences of being otherwise were too heavy to consider. He had responsibilities, students, reputation, and a life that intersected with mine at lines that were marked in blunt ink. I had my own life, small and precarious, and I kept it intact like candle flame in a jar. The first time he touched me in a way that spelled danger, it was casual, the sort of accidental intimacy that arrives when two people trust each other enough to be unfastened in each other's company. We sat on an old sagging couch in the department lounge after a critique, the fluorescent light still warm with the residue of other people's urgency. The couch had a certain smell-worn fabric and the faint scent of someone else's cologne, and we sat too close because the space was crowded and the room felt like a bubble where the rest of the world could be postponed. It was late. Students had thinned out and the echo of their conversations had diminished to the hum of the refrigerator. He had his leg tucked beneath him like a bracket, and I was watching him as if I could read the pattern of his face and know what was coming next. He reached into his coat and found a pastry that had been abandoned on his plate earlier. He offered it to me without looking, the gesture so small it could have been meaningless. But the way he stretched his hand across the gap between us felt like an administration of kindness and something else, an unaccounted-for warmth. My fingers brushed his when I took the pastry. For a second, absolutely nothing remarkable happened. Then, as if by law, his palm rested on mine a fraction longer than was necessary to pass the pastry. His fingers curled, not seductively, not with any declared hunger, but with the nonchalance of someone working a loose thread into place. It was a touch that could have been a professional courtesy, or the reflexive comfort of a friend, but in the intimate hush of the room, it read to me like a ledger that had finally been balanced one way and not the other. I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, that if I dared to name it to myself, if I called that touch desire, then the landscape of everything would change. Naming is a dangerous thing. Once you name a thing, you attend to it. Once you attend to it, it accumulates weight. For a long while I kept the naming in my head only, the syllables unvoiced, practicing the way an actor rehearses a line to keep it safe. And then the rhythm of our days shifted. There was a crisis, as crises tend to come in pairs. External pressure and internal unraveling. He had been in a relationship that was, on its surface, full of the ordinary accoutrements of a life well lived, an apartment with a view, shared calendars. A partner who fit into photographs on social media with the practiced neatness of a framed life. Then, quietly, that life ruptured. Breakups are not fireworks. They are a slow untying of ropes that had been knotted for years. His partner moved out, leaving behind a hollow where someone else's socks had been, and the scent of his exhaled breath on a pillow. I watched the effects of that untying like a scientist, watching a plant recalibrate to a sudden change in light. He became someone softer at the edges, less certain about the shape of things. The people who knew him noticed and offered platitudes that meant little. I noticed smaller things, an unfurled towel on the radiator in my studio because he had forgotten to pick his up, a stack of making supplies suddenly commandeered by his hands as he attempted to fumble with domesticity. Loneliness is a cold that makes even the warmest apartment feel like a rehearsal room. He would show up at odd hours, more often than before, with the pretext of wanting to look at a series of prints or to get advice about a lecture slide. The pretexts became rituals. He began to arrive at my studio in the rain because I lived half a block from the darkroom and my door was always open to him. He began to bring an extra mug as if to cross a threshold into a domesticity we had never shared. The first time he asked simply if he could sleep on my couch, I told him yes with the automatic reaction of someone who likes to offer shelter. I did not imagine that yes existing as a hinge. He smelled of the city and of someone who had recently rediscovered that his apartment was empty. He fell asleep the second his head hit the cushion. And I sat up long after the film had finished spinning to watch the way his chest rose and fell, to catalog the unprotectedness of his face, to feel my own heartbeat become a metronome. There was a peculiar cruelty to the way our physical proximity made the emotional space between us more acute. We had always been friends, the way people build a sandcastle together, careful, collaborative, and now there were waves creeping close enough to dissolve edges. I found myself awake in the early hours with the sound of his breath, a small tide in the room. I watched his hands, which on some days were quick and decisive, on other days trembled with the residue of a decision he had not yet made about who he would be without the other man's presence. He turned to me for counsel the way one leans on a railing, with the trust that the support will hold. He was careful in ways that masked their boldness. He would place his hand on my knee in the middle of a critique to emphasize a point about tension in an image. He would leave his coat on the back of my chair without seeming to consider the message. He would comment on my loneliness with a tenderness that made me want to tell him everything, and then immediately reasserted my boundaries in the same breath to avoid the shame of my confession. His behavior behaved in two languages at once, one public and pragmatic, the other intimate and coded in a way that could be dismissed with a smile. I had a habit of translating gestures into intentions, the way one translates a poem into plain speech. It is an occupation that feeds both joy and anxiety. I read the linger of his hand as an argument for more, but I also learned to interpret plausible deniability as an essential trait of the man. Plausibility like that is both safety and cruelty. He remained on the surface the sort of person who expressed his needs more through proximity than admission. He would fall asleep against my shoulder or stand in my doorway until I invited him in, and when anyone asked, he would laugh and call it bunking up, temporary relief, an arrangement of bodies, merely passing time. There is a special kind of terror that lives in the waiting room of interpretation. You imagine every possible version of what could happen from the single fact of his being near, scenarios that extend like films in your head, their frames filled with either relief or catastrophe. The fear of ruining our friendship was a principal law in my body. Friendships like ours were fragile, a valuable object you carried in both hands. The thought of smashing it in the clumsy attempt to name us was a paralytic logic. Better to keep things as they were than risk everything on a fumble. Then, one ordinary evening, everything moved, and the rules we had both tacitly agreed upon unspooled. There had been a series of small escalations, a dinner where he rested his hand on mine across the table and lingered, a movie night where he let his knee touch mine for the duration of the credits, a shared umbrella that left our jackets damp at the hem. We had been practicing closeness the way musicians practice the same bar until it is indistinguishable from memory. That night, after a lecture in the quiet of my studio with prints drying like small islands under lamps, he sat on my couch and read a book out loud to himself until his voice softened into a hum. I remembered the light, the exact pitch of its warmth, how shadows pooled at the corners of the room like sleep. He stopped reading mid-sentence and looked at me as if imagining the possibility of asking for something he feared to name. I was standing at the sink, folding a towel into exactness as if domestic rituals could anchor me. He called my name in a way that made the towel slip from my hands. He asked, soft as a confession, whether it would be all right if he rested his head in my lap. He said it like someone requesting permission that might be granted or refused, and the tonality of the question, vulnerable, uncertain, was itself a revelation. This was the point where the architecture of our relationship rearranged itself. He was using words like a hinge. He had not articulated desire as accusation. He had not demanded or brazenly seized. Instead, he had asked. I shifted my weight to accommodate him, thinking of all the times I had rehearsed what I would do if he crossed a line and imagining now that my rehearsals had not prepared me for the simpleness of a head on a thigh. His hair smelled like a winter marketplace pine and cold coffee, and the heat of his temple was a small burn in my palm. He breathed the way people do when they finally allow themselves to rest, a sound both ordinary and intimate. My thumb found the line of his jaw and traced it with the certitude people use to read a map lodged in a lived body. In that gesture, something in me made up its mind. The ritual began. Small things repeated themselves until they became grammar. He would arrive with a pretext, an article to discuss, a lecture slide to format, and stay until the world had grown small and domestic around us. We shared toothbrushes tucked into the same mug on the sink when he stayed over. He began to fall asleep in my arms the way someone falls asleep on a bus, exhausted and oddly surrendered. He would occasionally wake at 2 a.m. and stand at my window, hands on the glass, molding the cold moisture with his palms, as if he was trying to press an outline of himself into the dark. In those hours he was talkative in the way fish become talkative when they are out of the water, simple confessions surfacing without pretense, how he missed certain habits, how he feared being seen as the sort of man who sought comfort from cohabitation. Those nights were the slow, secret building of intimacy. He would unfurl stories that leaned into the edges of his life, small humiliations at faculty parties, the way wordless impatience had hollowed the last relationship, the way he had pretended not to cry at the closing of the curtains because he thought tears would be a betrayal of a professorial composure. He said these things without dramatic flourish, and that is what made them more devastating. Ordinary admissions do not demand applause, they only demand hearing. I heard him with the full, greedy attention of someone who had been waiting for a map and found one drawn in the crease of another person's back. I became hyper-aware of the map of him. There was an involuntary mathematics to my observations, the slope of his shoulders, the shadow his nose made on his upper lip in certain light, the small tremor in his voice when he articulated a decision he did not like. I tracked his moods with the scientist's patience I had once used to develop film: expose, soak, watch, rinse. When he was low, his fingers went to the same place on his wrist. When he was contented, he hummed when he moved. I started writing these things down, not in a confessional diary but as a catalog I could return to on nights when I felt uncertain. There was something of the pilgrim in me, an orientation toward one destination that made my life a series of preparatory rituals. He never spoke of the way he had started to rely on me. He did not say, "I need you," in plain language. He never spelled what he took from me. But actions accumulate into confessions. He would cradle my hand when I tried to leave a room, would twist his fingers into mine if we were walking and the city felt like an indifferent sea. He became more tactile, but always under the shelter of an explanation, the most frequent being exhaustion. There is a particular cruelty to plausible explanations. They are, by design, both true and incomplete. He was exhausted. He was lonely. He had forgotten how to make a home for himself. All those truths did not cancel the presence of desire, but they reframed it in patient, plausible terms. I learned to read his hand on my thigh in the dark like a weather forecast. Warning signs, clarifying breezes, the promise of rain. I tried to temper my own desires with caution. Part of me was terrified of what a full confession would do, a torch applied to the fragile construction of our friendship. But another part of me, a quieter and more honest part, was hungry for the comfort of named things. There is an enormous erosional power in unspoken feelings. They wear down boundaries in the night, and by morning someone else wakes up with the seams rearranged. And then the crossing happened, as crossings often do, in a moment that was both inevitable and astonishingly small. We had been watching an old film I loved. The celluloid light made the room a dim ocean, and we sat on the couch like two small ships. His head found my shoulder in a way that had become ritual, and this time, instead of pressing gently and letting it rest as before, he shifted until his mouth was near my ear. He asked, quick as a decision, whether he could kiss me. He said it like someone asking permission to borrow a book, but his voice was not casual. It trembled with the gravity of a man who had been circling an island for a very long time and finally found a boat. The question detached the last of my defenses. It also refused to be taken back into plausible deniability because it had been spoken. To ask is to demand an answer. He had broken the rule in a way that refused to be rolled back into friend status. The room held its breath. I remember thinking that if I said no, I would lose something profound. If I said yes, I would gain something equally terrifying. Consent can't be a shorthand for complacence, and there was a weighty honesty in his punctuation of the moment. I said yes. I cannot reproduce the exact interior noise of that single syllable without flattening its texture into banality. It was at once an acceptance and a plea. His hand found the back of my neck and cradled it as gently as a phrase in another language. The first kiss was slow and careful, like two people tracing a map they had memorized in secret. There was no cinematic frenzy, no collapse of order into fever. It was, rather, the simple registration of two truths, that he wanted this and that I wanted him to want it. What followed the kiss was not an unbroken stretch of relief. Crossings do not heal every injury, they rearrange the ground you stand on and reveal new fissures. For a while, we existed in a tenderly altered state. Less could be unsaid, because a new set of things had been made explicit. The intimacy that had been gestured toward now had nouns and verbs attached to it. We woke with arms draped across each other like a domestic semaphore, and in daylight there was the awkward negotiation of how to move through public and private with this new script. There were, inevitably, moments of fear. I found myself counting the small errors I had made, the ways I had misread earlier signs, and thus made myself vulnerable. He, in turn, seemed to vacillate between ease and recoil, as if sometimes the labeling of our relationship made him constricted in the way being watched makes a wild animal sit still. He confessed once, with the stabbing honesty I had come to expect from him when he was honest in the late hours, that he had been afraid of what people would say, of the way the Institute might react, of becoming a narrative rather than a person. His fear was not of me, it was of the consequences, the ripple effects that would touch both our lives in ways we had not fully considered. The first real test came in the form of the department party, an annual event where faculty and students mingled with the regulated intoxication of colleagues who had learned to be civil to one another's ambitions. We arrived as a pair, two people, two separate histories, and the room contracted around us. Friends glanced and made Jacobian calculations. There was history here, wasn't there? Couples had their own core of jokes to spare and their habitual ways of insinuating themselves into quiet corners. Our not yet public intimacy read to others as a force like an extra limb, and there were moments when a discomfited student would smile and then look away. I felt new weight in my chest that day, as if I were carrying an object given to me by a lover that I had to protect from strangers' curiosity. Later, in the private house of a colleague, he stood in the kitchen away from the crowd. He closed himself in the small domestic space of a refrigerator's hum and told me, as he had told me before, that he was frightened not of feeling, but of the work that would follow if he allowed feeling to exist in the open. He said the word responsibility with a particular slant. And I understood that what he feared was not passion but obligation, the imposition of others' expectations on a tenderness he had only just started to cultivate. He withdrew for a time after that evening. Not a dramatic severing. Rather, he pulled back like someone who is taking the sides out of a garment to see whether it will fall apart without support. The ritual we had settled into unthreaded in small ways. He attended fewer late-night sessions in my studio and answered emails more tersely. He began to speak more in hypotheticals about the future, and less in the immediate present. The pull of the practical world tenure clocks, committee meetings, the invisible processes that bind your life when you hold an academic title became a quiet but relentless force. It would have been easier to let the pull carry us apart. People who have been close in friendship and flinch from something more have a million plausible routes back to safety. But there is a peculiar violence in gradual avoidance, the brittle accumulation of small rejections that, in their sum, speak louder than any single argument. I felt stung, angry at the retreat, not because of wounded pride, but because of the smallness of my own hope that we might become more than the line-defined thing we had been. I asked him, finally, at 20 past midnight, on a night when the city sounded like an old record, whether he was leaving. It was a necessity rather than a cruelty, the way a surgeon makes an incision to see what lies beneath. His answer was a confession wrapped in defensive rationales. He admitted that the newness had frightened him. He said that he had always been the sort of person who measured risk in terms of consequences rather than impulses. He told me that he was not sure whether his taking of comfort from me had been an honest reaching or merely a way station. The honesty hurt, but it also contained a seed of something durable. He had told the truth. We fought in a way that was more akin to people attempting to explain their own maps to each other than to people trying to win. Words like boundary and intention and responsibility were passed back and forth like household objects. He was scared of stealing the work he had spent years doing by letting his private life be consumed by rumor. I was fearful that in his reflexive stepping away, I would be revealed to myself as someone who had only ever been a cheap consolation. Our argument did not resolve into neat reparations. Instead, it forced us both to articulate the contours of our fear, and in doing so, it made a space where honest decisions could be made. He came back into my life not with an apology at first, but with a readiness to explain himself in manner that was both unpretentious and painfully vulnerable. He divulged how, in the quiet between commitments, he had confronted images of himself. He had been too proud to face the version that needed another person's body to feel complete and the version that was terrified of impermanence. He told me that his reluctance had been rooted not in a lack of affection, but in an overabundant sense of caution. He loved the architecture of his life too rigidly to risk demolishing it. There is relief that comes with being understood, and there is a deeper relief in being accepted after making a mistake. He asked for forgiveness in the way a man might when he has finally cleared the dry debris of his own fear from a relationship and wants to make a new foundation. He did not expect to be forgiven simply because he asked. Instead, he asked because he needed to demonstrate he was willing to change the terms under which we existed. I listened to him as if each sentence were a new print placed under light, nervous, hopeful, rendered with a care that suggested permanence might be possible. The crossing had consequences that required repair work. We had to harmonize what intimacy meant to us in both private and public spheres. We had to agree on boundaries and on the manner of our disclosure. The most radical and practical step he took was to tell his colleagues in a small group first, people he trusted, that he was in a relationship and that it was genuine. It was not a theatrical reveal. It was a quiet, administrative action with moral weight. Standing beside him, I felt a curious, domestic pride, an absurd and sudden sense of belonging that was the opposite of a shout and more like a lamp being lit in a shared room. There were smaller victories that felt like changes wrought by time and patience. We learned to kiss in public without a furtive style that made us feel conspiratorial. We learned how to hold hands on the street so that it was not an announcement but a simple, habitual fact. He found ways to anchor me in his life that did not require renunciation of my own shape, inviting me to department dinners, to meet other partners, to be integrated into small practices that signaled we were, for lack of a better word, normal. Love, when it is made gentle and not demanded, might be one of the most ordinary of domestic arts. We sat across from each other on many mornings over burnt toast, aligning experiences like tiles to build a path. He would brush crumbs off my lip with the back of his hand like he was brushing lint from a costume before a show. We learned the way each other liked coffee, the tilt of the sheets where sleep made soft sculptures, the precise distance he preferred between his shoulders and mine while we read. The small domestic acts, repeated enough times, formed a new grammar of affection. There were times when the past came back as an ache. His ex would appear in the periphery of a conversation as an unnameable ghost, a bilateral memory whose footprint remained in certain rooms. He handled those moments with a patience I admired, brief honesty, unadorned, and then back to the work of building us. He once confided in the dark that sometimes he missed the idea of a past routine because routines are predictable and therefore safe. I told him what I had told myself 1,000 times. Safety should not be the enemy of risk, when the risk is the pursuit of a person who holds you tenderly. The months that followed were slow and tender. There were trips and small fights, reconciliations that began with him apologizing awkwardly, and me taking his hand until he stopped talking. We argued not about grand infidelities or betrayal, but over mundane things: who left the kettle on, who forgot to lock the door. These arguments were ordinary in the way domestic disagreements are, full of petty pride and then the quick, reconciliatory humor that followed. Those squabbles were a sort of proof that our life together could contain the trivial as well as the profound. There was a day, sometime into our second winter together, when we sat on the couch, the same couch that had once been the threshold, and he put his hand in mine and said, softly, that he had begun to think of himself as a man who belonged somewhere. He said the phrase like it was a new thing to say out loud and watched my face the way he used to watch a developing image for signs of emergence. There was no dramatic flourish in his words, only a quiet truth shining like a small coin. I felt my body answer with an ease I had not known before, as if I had been carrying a stone in my pocket for years and now finally set it down. We settled into a domestic geometry that was unremarkable in its comfort. Our routines were a kind of architecture: coffee at dawn, the ritual clearing of plates, the shared irritation at the cat who refused to be trained, the gentleness of our rituals when sleep hollowed us and we found each other's hands in the dark like anchors. He taught me that safety is not the absence of fear, it is the presence of someone willing to keep showing up. I learned how to be both a lover and a friend in ways that enlarged my vocabulary of being. The precariousness I had once cherished as autonomy became, in its new form, a chosen solitude shared with someone who made space rather than occupied it. To say that everything was perfect would be a false sort of closure. We had days of small resentments, moments when the professional pressures on him leaked into our late nights grading, a conference presentation that required him to travel. I had my own work, portraits to shoot, galleries to visit, film clunking through the machine. But within the ordinary friction of two lives with different schedules and obligations, we cultivated intentionality. We spoke frankly about compromises and the meanings of commitment. We developed a language for the ordinary intimate things, the way he liked the blinds tilted, the phrase he would say when leaving the house that meant he would call, the small phrase, "come home," that we folded into our lives without fanfare. He was not without his moments of fragile retraction. There were nights, still, when he would awake and stare into the dark, fingers trailing the spine of a book as if searching for an answer among pages that were not yet printed. He would tell me, in fits of confession, that old reflexes worried him, the automatic recoil to preserve a narrative of the self as someone who could be alone and uncompromised. I would hold him then, the way someone holds an instrument in an orchestra whose part is both delicate and indispensable. I learned the art of the question that asked less to trap than to tilt. Are you afraid? Do you want to be here? He told me, quietly, that what he had wanted for so long was not the spectacle of romance, but a harbor whose geography could be trusted. He wanted to be allowed to be seen without being judged and to be accepted with the full weight of his contradictions. He told me he had been terrified of becoming the sort of man who traded a professional reputation for a private comfort, as if love was a currency that might bankrupt him. I told him what I had eventually told myself, that love does not erase responsibility, it reshapes it. Responsibility becomes not an external ledger but a mutual care. There was no spectacular finale to our story. Instead, there was an accumulation of days, each small and intimate, a hand at the small of the back as we navigated a crowded gallery, a note left on the coffee jar reading "Please make more," a quiet, deliberate kiss at the sink as we prepared dinner. These were the ways a life tethers itself to another. Our love was not a revolution so much as an artisan's careful restoration, removing old paint layers to discover the grain beneath, and then, with patient attention, reapplying a finish that allowed the surface to breathe. One spring, when the light leaned the way it does right before a photograph is taken, we decided to make our home official to the small cadre of people whose recognition meant something: family, and a few close friends. It was a low-key celebration with bread baked by someone who knew the recipe for the sort of comfort you cannot buy, and there were toasts that said things like, "about time," and "we're so happy for you," which are themselves small absolutions. The celebration did not change us so much as it acknowledged the architecture we had quietly built with our hands. I dreamed often, as people do when they are trying to imagine a future, in domestic details. In my dreams we had a hallway with a framed photograph of us in a small frame, our names silently bracketed together in a private canon. I imagined that someday our small past fears would be the seed of a story to tell. I thought about how time lends perspective, softening the sharp teeth of earlier anxieties into something like narrative. Memory is a sort of story we keep retelling. The way we tell it shapes what we choose to keep and the things we let fall out of the script. There were afternoons, later, when we would sit on our porch and watch a storm gather like an argument on the horizon. Neither of us was perfect at love. We both had slips and selfish moments, and we had to forgive more than once. But forgiveness became in our life a habit of small mercy rather than a dramatic reparation. It was an act as ordinary as making coffee, an insistence on kindness. We learned to craft an ongoing conversation about the future, about whether or not to move cities for a job, about the ways we would leave space for one another to be whole individuals rather than merely halves. The mutuality of those discussions was the deepest promise we gave each other. There are still nights when I wake and remember the way the first touch landed long enough to make me tremble, the way his hand found mine in the dark when he sought comfort. The confusion and the fear and the relief that attended our crossing. I do not misremember the risks we took. I keep them like a currency for gratitude. Those early months of unsure tenderness taught me more than any other time of recognition. They taught me that being available for love does not mean erasing yourself, but rather that you build new rooms and invite someone else to move alongside you without demolishing what you were. If a story can be said to have a moral, it is only this: that the courage to be honest with another person is both the risk and the reward. We had to risk craning open a fragile thing to see what breath it held. We had to name our needs and fears and then learn how to live with both being named. Our friendship was not ruined by admission. It was remade into something closer and truer. There is a particular holiness to that slow, patient remaking. When I look back now, when the year has peeled into a collection of seasons, I am aware that what binds us is not a dramatic blaze, but a continuous small glow. We have learned to love in ways that are tender and intentional. We fold one another into the corners of the day and make a life of those folds. The professor became my companion, and the companion became my home. That he once made me kneel in the metaphorical sense, made me lower my armor for the first time with the gentle ask of a question, has become, in memory, an invitation I am grateful I accepted. In the quiet hours, when the house is breathing and the cat lunatically patrols the small territorial borders of our life, I sometimes replay the conversation that began it. I hear his voice, hushed and apprehensive, ask for permission, and I remember how the act of consenting was a kind of sanctification. Consent did not feel like concession. It felt like the beginning of a life in which honesty was the structure we built upon. There are doors you cross not because you see the other side clearly, but because someone you trust offers you their hand and asks that you take it. The courage of that kind of crossing is not the absence of fear, but the insistence that fear will not govern the entirety of a life. I learned that my own precautions were a useful garment I could repair and wear differently. I also learned that leaning into another person can be a brave act that creates in ordinary rooms, on couches, in late-night kitchens, in the middle of rain-slick streets, a feeling like home. We began to count our days not by milestones alone but by small mercies. The first time he said, "I love you," in a moment that was not demanded of him unprompted, during a thunderstorm when we had both aged into sleep, felt like a new kind of daylight. I did not respond immediately because the word filled me with its own seriousness. Instead, I wrapped him tighter and let the warmth of the house and the small certainty of his breath be the answer. Later, I did say it back, but in the way that was true to me, with steady accumulation rather than a single flag planted. We discovered that intimacy was a craft practiced in repetition. The rituals we had once used as pretexts had become the scaffolding of our comfort: an exchanged coat, the offhandedness of a hand finding another in the night, the phrase left on a sticky note on the fridge that said, "I'm on my way, keep the bread warm." Even when our lives demanded a degree of separation, conferences, exhibitions, the thin sorrows of career decisions, we had built a durable practice of returning. Practice makes habit, and habit makes home. If there is a closure to tell, it is not a neat ending but a folding of one life into another with respect and care. The life we have made is honest about its earlier terrors and tender about the present small pleasures. The professor taught me to be generous with my confessions, and I taught him how to accept them without flinching. We are both better students of the language of loving now, having learned to speak plainly and to listen. And so I keep that opening line in my mind, the idea that ordinary things can be thresholds, because it comforts me to know I did not misread the world entirely. The way a hand rests on a knee, the way a head finds a lap, the soft phrase asking for a kiss, these are the small, explosive, ordinary acts that quietly rearrange us. I have learned, finally, that when the person you trust asks to kneel at your altar of attention, you can choose to stand with them and make a life that holds both of you. There are moments in life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and when you cross the threshold you discover that the room on the other side is furnished in a gentler way than you had dared imagine. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The days that followed were not thunderclaps of revelation, but the steady weathering of two people learning to keep a small, shared light lit. I found myself cataloging the newness of ordinary hours as if I were assembling a photographic series, each frame a practice in noticing, the way his thumbs smoothed my hair at the nape while we read on the couch. The particular smell the kitchen carried when he heated the last of a soup he'd made 3 nights earlier because he said it tasted better on the 4th day. The soft exhale he made when I said something private that had nothing to do with the world beyond our apartment. I kept writing these moments down in my head, not to turn them into proof of anything dramatic, but to give them a contour so they could be trusted, so they could be held up in the quiet later and examined without fear. He had a habit of standing in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, elbows resting against the frame, watching the light gather on the floorboards in the late afternoon. And I came to interpret that posture as a question. Sometimes he asked nothing. Sometimes he said, "Are you still there?" with the kind of small, sheepish need that used to be aimed at a sports broadcast when the game was on. Once, while he was doing it, I reached for his hand without thinking, and the hand I expected to be warm from the sun was cool from the apartment's shade. Still, the contact felt like a deliberate punctuation in a sentence we'd finally agreed to write together. We did not dramatize the mechanics of it. There were no long, staged conversations where we charted the topography of our feelings. There were instead the rituals, shared groceries that turned into shared meals, one of us falling asleep while the other finished a sketch on the coffee table. The quiet exchange of keys that meant you could come over whenever you needed. In the smallness of those repetitions, my fear, which had once felt like a waiting room of anxious scenarios, began to shrink into something manageable, an old ache that had learned to be less loud in the presence of another steady body. He was not without his confusions. There were nights when he would wake with a start and apologize for nothing, then apologize again for apologizing, and I would sit up and say, "Stop," and offer him a blanket like a map back to where the world was safe. He would laugh, the laugh that carried a tiredness I recognized from nights before we claimed one another, and say, "You make it sound simple." I would tell him that simple is an adjective, not a promise, and he would press his forehead to mine, and we would equate ourselves quietly, two people practicing how to breathe in proximity. There was a day in autumn when he called me from a highway rest stop, gravel crunching under his shoes, and said I sat in the car for an hour and thought about whether to call you. His voice on the line had the thin, honest edge of someone discovering a truth in the pause between sentences. I imagined him in the car, wind rushing over a map he could not fold right, and I felt the old impulse to reassure him to patch everything back into place. Instead I said, "Call me again next time you sit in the car," and he laughed, a sound half relief, half conspiracy, and agreed. That call built itself into our architecture, the realization that he could interrupt his days with me, and we would be okay. We learned to be tender without ceremony. When he was tired, he came home and leaned his head on my shoulder even before he had removed his jacket. When I was lost in a print, he would rest his fingers along the margin of the image as if reading my thought. Once, in a moment that felt both trivial and holy, he asked, "Would it be presumptuous if I kissed you good night?" And the question landed in the room like a soft rain. I said, "It would be honest," and so he bent and touched his lips to mine in a feathered, careful way that felt exactly like a beginning. Conflict arrived, not as a crisis, but as the usual, stubborn irritant of human life, ambition and insecurity braided through our days. An opportunity in another city that he considered and then declined because of the way our mornings had come to begin, a series of late emails that made him restless, and my own old reflex to freeze when a decision involved someone else's future. He confessed one evening, voice raw in the dark, that he had once thought love was a performance, something to be achieved in grand gestures. I said that I had thought of it as a still life you could study forever, and he smiled in the dark in a way that seemed to rearrange the room. We argued, once, about the boundary between independence and togetherness, how much space was generous and how much was a retreat, and it was the kind of argument that scared me because I feared it might name a difference too big to reconcile. We came through it because neither of us wanted to retreat to safety. In the aftermath, we sat at the kitchen table with 2 mugs cooling between our hands, and he said, "I am scared I will damage what we have." I said, "I am scared I will hide and you will leave without me ever knowing." He put his hand flat on the table and I put mine over it, and the contact was a binding, neither theatrical nor quiet. He said, "Tell me what you need," and I said, "Talk to me even when it's small," which sounded like a compromise but felt like the language of survival. The small rituals resumed, now with an awareness of their fragility. Sometimes he would cook and forget the salt and apologize, and we would both laugh as the soup adjusted under the missing trace. Sometimes I would overcommit to work, and he would insist I stop, and his insistence felt like a reclamation of me from my own habits. We learned to say things in the present tense. I am here, I will come back, I want you to sleep. They were little sentences with the gravity of vows. By winter we had established a new normal, not perfection, but a table set for two where plates no longer slid apart. The apartment retained the scent of his cologne on the linen and my paints on the windowsill. The door that once stood literally and figuratively open to doubtful interpretations now closed with a confidence that felt domestic and good. We started to speak in a way that made room for mistakes and apologies and small repairs, and that language told us more about future possibilities than any single grand confession could. On a cold morning when the city seemed to hold its breath, he stood at the window watching the outline of the trees against a gray sky and said, "I do not know what the world will ask of us, but I know I want to find out with you." The sentence landed like a soft bell. I turned to him and felt the old, complicated ache of gratitude and desire settle into a steadier line. I said, "Then we will practice." He laughed, which was the sound of a person given permission to be tender, and reached for me. We moved through the day like well-worn pages, touching and rereading small certainties we had earned. There are no cinematic endings to tell, only the slow, careful accumulation of days, of hands that learned to find each other in the dark. We had crossed the threshold not by a single theatrical act, but by the patient practice of return, and that practice became our promise. In the quiet that followed, we kept tending the honest, ordinary light we had found, and, in doing so, learned to call our life by a name that sounded like home.